In the quiet village of Oduku, a woman returned again and again to urinate on the grave of a beautiful girl. But what the villagers didn't know was that behind her hatred hid a deadly truth. This is not just a story about shame, it's about jealousy, death, and the grave that refused to stay silent. In the heart of Oduku, a village shadowed by myths and ruled by unspoken laws, there stood a sacred baobab tree. For generations, that tree had watched over the village like a wise elder, its gnarled roots curled around secrets too heavy for the earth to carry. And just beyond the baobab, beneath a blanket of red sand and forgotten memories, lay a lonely grave. It belonged to a girl named Kambili, whose beauty once made the rain jealous and the moon shy. But no one spoke her name anymore. Old women would lower their voices when passing the grave. Children were warned never to play near it. And every market day, a strange thing happened. One woman by the name of Olachi would sneak behind the baobab, squat over the grave, and urinate. Not once, not twice, but many times. No one dared question her. They whispered behind closed doors. She must be cursed, they said, or possessed. But Olachi never looked mad. She looked angry. Her eyes burned with something older than hate, something deeper. She never missed a single week. Rain or sun, wind or drought, Olachi came like the rising of the cock's crow. Some say the earth trembled beneath her. Some say Kambili's grave had started to crack, but no one knew the real story. Not yet. Many years before Olachi's strange rituals began, the village had gathered to bury its brightest flower. Kambili had died young, only 19. Her skin glowed like polished bronze, her hair coiled in perfect rings, and her voice carried like the wind chimes tied to goat pens. Men fought over her, women studied her, elders watched her in silence, fearful of the power she carried just by existing. But the day she died, the sky did not mourn. The sun shone harshly as if angry at her stillness. Her white wrapper was clean, but her body bore marks, marks that were covered quickly before her mother could ask questions. The elders rushed the burial, no drummers, no dancers, no wailing women, only a silence thick enough to choke a spirit. They said she drowned in the river, but those who saw her body said her lungs were dry. Others said she was poisoned. Some claimed it was love that killed her. But the truth was wrapped and buried with her. The villagers moved on, the world forgot, but her grave remembered. And so did Olachi. Olachi wasn't always bitter. In her youth, she was known as the best palm wine tapper's daughter, always seen laughing under mango trees, her headscarf tied perfectly, her waist beads jingling when she walked. But her glow began to fade the same year Kambili arrived in the village. The two were close in age, but worlds apart. Where Olachi was earthy and wild, Kambili was graceful and calm. People began to compare them, harmless at first, then cruel. Kambili cooks better, Kambili's skin is smoother. Kambili walks like royalty. Alachi felt herself shrinking. One day something happened, a betrayal, a truth too ugly to speak aloud. After that day, Olachi stopped laughing. She stopped dancing, and the next time she was seen smiling, it was on the day Kambili was buried. Years passed, and Olachi never married. She never left Oduku. Instead, she clung to her pain, returning to the grave like a widow returns to the scene of a crime, haunted but unable to look away. She believed the dead girl still owed her something, but what she didn't know was that the grave was listening and soon it would answer. It began on a Tuesday night when the moon wore a crooked smile and the wind refused to rest. Olachi had just returned from the grave, her wrapper damp, her steps heavy. The path home was familiar, yet something felt wrong. The air around her smelled of dust and burnt memories. Crickets paused, dogs whimpered in their sleep. Even her old oil lamp flickered without wind. That night, the whispers began. At first, she thought it was a dream. The soft voice that curled through the corners of her hut like smoke, a gentle hum like the sound of someone brushing hair. Then came a faint giggle, not mocking, not warm, just there like a forgotten song. Olachi sat up in her raffia bed, her eyes darting around the room. Nothing moved, but the air felt crowded. She reached for her charm bag, tied with red thread and old teeth, muttering incantations her grandmother taught her, but the voice only laughed. It whispered her name, Olachi. And in that moment, the air turned cold, the kind of cold that doesn't come from outside, but from below, from deep inside the ground, from the grave. A week later, three children, Amobi, Chioma, and little Ebuka, chased the goat near the baobab. Their laughter echoed like drums across the dry grass. But as they reached the sacred tree, they paused. Something stood near the grave. A girl dressed in white, her feet bare, her hair flowing as if caught in slow wind. She wasn't walking, she was hovering. Amobi, the oldest, blinked and rubbed his eyes. Kioma grabbed Ibuka's hand. The girl turned slowly, her eyes like glass, her lips curved in a half smile that didn't reach her eyes. Then she was gone. The children ran screaming to the elders, but like always, the adults dismissed them. Spirits don't roam in daylight, they said, but by evening the baobab's leaves turned yellow. By morning, the grave had cracked a little more, and that was the first time someone else, apart from Olachi, heard the name Kambili spoken again in the village. When the whispers grew louder and the shadows longer, the village grew uneasy. The elders, reluctant but alarmed, summoned Baba Uzu, the blind priest who lived near the cursed forest. He was old, older than even the chief's father, and it was said he once spoke with spirits during a famine that nearly wiped Oduku from the map. When Baba Uzu arrived, silence fell like rain. He placed his cowrie shells on the cracked earth, his hands trembling slightly as he rolled them beside Kambili's grave. One by one, the shells flipped and danced, forming a strange circle no one had seen before. His brows furrowed, his lips moved, but no sound escaped. Then his face turned pale. Baba Uzu stood up, his staff sinking deep into the earth as he backed away slowly. She is not resting, he finally said, but when asked why, he would not answer. He left the village that night. Some say he never made it back to his shrine. Some say he did, but not as a man. And Olaki, she heard the news like one hears the sound of distant thunder, heavy, inevitable, but far enough to ignore. She still went to the grave, still squatted, still whispered curses, but her face was changing now. Her eyes were darker, her hands shook after every visit. She thought she was in control. She didn't know Kambili had started to remember, and remembering was only the beginning. At dawn, a thin mist settled over Oduku like a warning. The villagers moved slower than usual, speaking in hushed tones, casting wary glances toward the sacred baobab. The air smelled of old rain and fear, and no one could explain the strange chill that lingered even as the sun began to rise. Olachi's compound was no different. She sat on a low stool outside her hut, scraping yam with a rusty blade, her eyes distant, her face harder than the day before. The ground around her had started cracking, not just at the grave, but right at her doorstep. Tiny lines crept like veins through the red earth, pulsing slightly as if alive. She had begun to sleep with her windows shut, her door barred with charms, her ears stuffed with cotton, but it didn't help. The whispering had grown bolder. Now they didn't wait for nightfall. Now they followed her everywhere. When she fetched water, she heard giggles behind trees. When she stirred her soup, the steam carried voices. Her name repeated softly, Olachi, Olachi. The village women noticed she had stopped greeting anyone. Her wrapper was stained, her eyes red, her steps uneven, but none dared confront her. Not after what happened to the last person who did, Mama Ejike, who mocked Olachi outside the shrine and was found the next day with her tongue swollen beyond her mouth. They said it was a bee sting, but the bees had vanished from Oduku 2 moons ago. One night, as the wind howled and thunder rolled beyond the hills, Olaki awoke to a sound, soft, steady, like someone gently tapping glass. She lit her oil lamp with shaking hands and turned toward the corner of her hut where her mirror hung. A gift from her mother long ago, it had once reflected a smiling, proud young woman, but not tonight. Tonight it was covered in fog from the inside. Olachi stood slowly, her breath shallow. As she moved closer, her reflection began to change. Her face flickered between present and past. First, the tired woman she had become, then the younger self she once was, then someone else. Kimberly. There she was, her full lips, her flawless skin, her unblinking eyes, but her face was smeared with dust as though she had risen from under the earth. Her head tilted slightly, her expression calm, almost pitiful. Then her lips moved, no sound, just movement. But Olachi knew what she said. You know what you did? In a scream that shattered the night, Olachi threw her calabash at the mirror. It crashed, splintering across the room, but even with shards on the floor, Kambili's eyes remained, watching from each broken piece. That night, Olachi did not sleep. That night, she realized Kambili was not only awake, she was angry. Years ago, before the bitterness and curses, there was a riverbank. Two young girls, Olachi and Kambili, bathed under the moonlight, their laughter echoing through the valley. They were not enemies then, they were sisters in spirit, bound by secrets, by dreams of escaping Oduku and marrying men who would build palaces for them in faraway towns. But one night changed everything. It was the night of the New Yam Festival. Kambili had been crowned Ada Ugo, the most beautiful maiden of Oduku. She wore coral beads. She danced with the chief's son. Her name was chanted. Her smile stretched the stars. And Olaki, she stood in the shadows, clutching her heart like a torn wrapper. Jealousy is not always loud. Sometimes it is silent and dangerous. That night, Kambili disappeared for hours. By morning, she was found near the river, lifeless. The story told to the village was a lie, crafted in haste. But Olachi remembered the truth, a truth she buried with Kambili, a truth now digging its way out. Olachi's compound grew quieter with each passing day. Even her chickens, once noisy at dawn, now roamed in silence. One old hen, her favorite, stopped laying eggs and stopped crowing. Instead, it perched on the roof each night, staring into the forest as if it expected someone to return from the dead. Villagers had begun to avoid Olachi's path. Children were forbidden from collecting firewood near her home. A young boy who dared to mimic her urinating gesture was slapped by his mother and warned never to mock spirits. Everyone knew something was wrong, but no one had the courage to call it by name. The cracks at the baobab widened, the earth coughed up bones, small ones. A shrine boy sweeping leaves found a gold earring near the grave, just one shaped like a cowrie shell. Kambili's signature ornament. But no one took it. It was left lying under the tree, glinting like an eye in the sun, and then the wind returned. Not the kind that cools the face or shakes the mangoes loose. This wind spoke. It howled with a voice that carried a woman's grief and rage. The wind said she did not fall. She was pushed. There was one person in the village who had never spoken since Kambili's burial. Mama Zita, the old midwife with the twisted back and a voice hoarse from herbs and secrets. She had helped bring Kambili into the world, and some say she saw her taken out of it. One morning, she came to the market square carrying a calabash filled with sand and red hibiscus petals. She placed it at the village center and sat beside it. Villagers gathered, curious. She never did anything without reason. Then, with a voice like dry leaves rubbing together, she spoke. They say Kambili drowned. I say she was buried twice, first in the river, then in a lie. The square went silent. She came to me the night she died, Mama Zita continued. She couldn't speak. Her lips were cracked, her neck bruised, her hands twisted like someone had held her down. A collective gasp rose. She showed me who was there, but I stayed quiet. I was afraid. Mama Zita reached into the calabash and lifted a clump of hair, long, black, coiled tightly, not Kambili's, Olachi's. How did I get this? She asked no one in particular. The village stared. No one spoke. No one moved. But in the shadows, Olachi watched, and for the first time, her knees buckled. That night, with nothing but a lantern and a shaking breath, Olachi returned to the grave, not to curse it, not to defile it, but to speak. Her hands trembled, her eyes swollen from tears she didn't know how to cry anymore. She sat beside the cracked earth and whispered, I remember. The night had been quiet. Kambili had just returned from dancing. They argued. Olachi had found a love note in her wrapper, addressed not to her, but to Kambili from the man she believed was hers. Something in her broke. Rage came like thunder. They fought near the riverbank, shouting turned to shoving, and Kambili fell. She didn't scream, she didn't fight, she just slipped into silence. Olaki didn't mean to kill her, but she also didn't help her live. She watched, she left, then she lied. She helped bury the truth and made sure no one asked questions, but the earth always remembers. She sobbed now, face pressed to the dirt, the same dirt she had once shamed. The wind circled her, cold and sharp, but not cruel, almost listening. And in the trees, the nightbirds stopped singing. The grave didn't crack that night, but something deeper did. Olachi's soul. After Olachi's confession to the earth, the village expected peace to return. But what came next shook Oduku to its roots. That night, the sky bled. Red rain fell, not just a drizzle, but a heavy pounding downpour that stained rooftops, soaked clothes, and turned the ground into red sludge. The elders huddled in the shrine, murmuring old prayers, their faces pale as the river clay. Birds refused to fly, goats wailed like children, and lightning danced not in the sky, but around the baobab tree. Kambili's grave steamed. The crack on the grave spread wide, revealing the edge of her white wrapper, still clean despite the years. No animal had dared disturb it. Not a single worm touched her flesh. She had not decomposed like others. She had waited, and now the land itself seemed to rise with her. That night, a girl named Ngozi, a distant cousin of Kambili, dreamed of her. In her sleep, Kambili stood barefoot, glowing, unbruised, with tears on her cheeks. She said just one thing, tell her, I waited for the truth. Ngozi woke screaming, drenched in sweat, her bed soaked like she had bathed in a river. When the villagers heard her tale, no one laughed. Because three others had the same dream, the elders of Oduku, men who once ruled with wisdom and fear, now found themselves powerless. The priest was gone, the rain wouldn't stop, dreams turned into visions. And now the people were talking about Kambili, about Olachi, about the lie that held the village together like weak thread. They summoned Olachi. She came barefoot, dressed in a ragged wrapper, her hair uncombed, her body lean from sleepless nights, but her eyes, they were clear. She knelt before the council, not as a criminal, but as a broken witness of her own deed. I killed her. She said, I didn't stab her. I didn't push her into fire, but I let my jealousy become a weapon. I let it grow teeth. I stood by as my sister died. There was silence, then murmuring, then anger. Some called for banishment, others cried. But the eldest of the council, Baba Ozi, raised his staff and said, the spirits have punished her more than we can. Still, the question remained, what of the grave? What of Kambili's spirit now disturbed and awake? No one answered. Because the baobab tree had begun to weep, sap leaked like tears down its bark, and the wind sounded like a sob. Desperate for peace, the village agreed to perform Ife Udio, the ritual of last apology, an ancient cleansing rite never performed in living memory. It required the offender to sleep beside the grave for 3 nights under the sky, offering confessions not to people, but to the soul of the dead. If the spirit accepted, a white dove would appear at dawn. If not, the grave would swallow the confessor whole. Alachi agreed. She lay on a raffia mat beside the grave as the first night crept in. The wind howled, fireflies formed a ring around her. The villagers watched from a distance, holding torches, praying silently. Olachi whispered her memories to the stars. She told Kambili of the love they once shared, the laughter under the mango trees, the promises whispered by moonlight. She told her how envy came like a shadow and how she never knew how to fight it. She told her how she wished it was her in that grave. And as the sky lightened, as the cocks began to crow, a soft flutter rose from the baobab's branches. A dove, pure white, silent, it landed on the grave, pecked gently at the earth, and flew toward the rising sun. A sign. The village exhaled, but Olachi wept harder because forgiveness doesn't erase guilt, it only gives it a quieter place to rest. The village of Oduku stirred with new air. For the first time in moons, the wind was soft again. The red rain had stopped. Children peeked from behind compounds, and the baobab tree stood motionless, its bark dry and firm once more. But the peace was heavy, like a silence that had not yet decided if it would stay. Olachi returned to her compound with nothing in her hands, no wrapper tied with pride, no greeting on her lips. She was not celebrated, she was not condemned, she simply was the woman who confessed to a grave. The white dove was all the villagers needed to believe that Kambili's spirit had released its grip. But inside Olachi, the release was different. It wasn't freedom, it was a wound, reopened and cleaned, but not yet closed. She walked past the stream where she and Kambili once fetched water, her feet unsure, her head bowed. A girl from the village, no older than 12, saw her and looked away, not with hatred, but confusion. A legend was walking, breathing, carrying shame like a basket of fire, and still the whisper followed her. You know what you did. But this time it was her own voice saying it. News traveled slowly through the bush, but quickly through the dead. One morning, a woman arrived in Oduku on bare feet and swollen ankles. She wore a wrapper that had once been royal blue, now faded to ash. Her eyes were sunken but sharp. It was Kambili's mother, a dowry who had vanished after her daughter's burial. Some believed she drowned herself, others believed she ran mad and wandered the forest, but she had not died. She had been waiting for a sign, and the dove had called her. She arrived at the grave without asking directions. The villagers followed in silence as she knelt before her daughter's resting place and poured libation from a broken gourd. She sang an old lullaby, the kind that only mothers know, the kind that hushes even the wind. Then she stood and walked toward Olachi's compound. Olachi saw her from afar and froze. The woman she had wronged, the mother of the girl she left to die, the one soul whose forgiveness could burn more than any curse. Adari stopped at her gate. She did not weep, she did not shout, she simply said, I knew it was you. Olaki collapsed at her feet, sobbing into the dust, but Idari did not touch her. Some wounds are too deep for comfort. She turned and walked away, and that silence was heavier than any slap. As seasons changed, something strange began to happen around the baobab. The earth, once cracked and bleeding, began to smooth itself. From nowhere, white sand blew over Kambili's grave, not gray, not red, white. No one could explain it. It wasn't salt, it wasn't ash, it was soft, almost powdery, like ground pearls. The elders declared it a final sign. The spirit had rested. Young girls began tying white beads around their waists in Kambili's honor, believing it would protect them from envy and betrayal. Her story turned from a haunting into a lesson. They no longer feared her, they honored her. Olachi never visited the grave again, but every week she fetched water from the stream and placed a calabash of fresh water at her gate, one for herself and one for Kambili, a peace offering in silence, not to erase what was done, but to remember what should never be repeated. And sometimes at night, villagers swore they heard two women laughing by the river, like before, like always. The river where Kambili died had once been nameless, a simple bend of water where children played and lovers whispered promises. But after her death, no one dared speak of it. The path grew overgrown, the banks silent, the water slow and dark. Mothers told their children never to go there after sunset, not because of snakes, but because of silence. But that changed. A group of young girls from the village, led by Ngozi, the one who dreamed of Kambili, went to the river with white stones and palm fronds. They cleaned the path, sang songs of healing, and planted flowers near the place where the tragedy occurred. Then, with the permission of the elders, they renamed it Mamiri Nwanyi, the water of the woman. It was not in honor of how she died, but how she endured. From that day on, it became a place of refuge, especially for women. Those who had been mocked, beaten, silenced, or forgotten came there to cry, to wash, to remember. And sometimes in the hush between wind and water, they felt a presence, a quiet warmth, a soft ripple, as if someone was sitting beside them. The spirit of Kambili no longer haunted. She listened. 1 month after the ritual of last apology, a meeting was called, unlike any that had been held in Oduku before. It was not summoned by chiefs or priests, but by the women. They gathered in the square wearing white wrappers and tied red cloth around their heads. Some were young, some carried children, others were as old as the village itself. But all carried wounds, some fresh, others hidden beneath decades of silence. They called it Umunwa Anyi na Eziokwu, daughters and truth. One by one, they spoke of jealousy between sisters, of abuse masked by culture, of deaths declared natural that were anything but. And for the first time, men sat and listened, not with folded arms, but with eyes lowered. Olachi was there too. She did not speak much. She had already said enough, but when it was her turn, she stood and said, "May no girl be buried in silence again." The crowd bowed their heads, and from the back, an old woman hummed a tune, one only Kambili used to sing. Others joined, and soon the whole square was filled with a melody that rose like incense. Pain turned to music, memory to meaning. Seasons shifted once more. Harmattan gave way to soft rains, and one morning something extraordinary happened at Kambili's grave. Flowers bloomed, not planted, not sown, just there. Bright yellow blossoms with red centers, petals shaped like small eyes. Botanists couldn't name them, elders had never seen them, but the villagers called them Anyanwu Kambili, Kambili's eye. They said it was her way of watching over the village, not in anger, but in silent care. People began to visit the grave, not to weep, not to curse, but to sit and reflect. Travelers left beads, poems, bracelets. Some brought newborn daughters and whispered blessings into the earth. The grave had become sacred, a place of warning, a place of peace. Olachi came only once more. She knelt, placed a cowrie shell beside the biggest flower, and whispered, "Sleep well, sister." The flower trembled in the wind, and for the first time in many years, Olachi smiled, not because she was healed, but because the wound had finally stopped bleeding. Years passed, the village of Oduku changed. A new chief ruled with humility. The baobab tree no longer groaned in the wind. Children, once forbidden to go near the sacred grave, now danced around it with calabashes and white beads. And each year, during the month of remembrance, the people held a festival, not for gods, not for kings, but for two women. It was called Iri Nwanyi Abuo, the festival of two daughters. Kambili, the girl of beauty and grace who died too young. Olachi, the girl of fire and shame who lived long enough to face her truth. Their names were sung not as rivals, but as a warning and a blessing. Young girls were taught to love each other, not compete. Mothers whispered to daughters, "Your shine does not dull another's." During the festival, two girls were chosen each year to wear the symbolic wrappers, one white, one red. They led a dance near the river, now called Miri Nwanyi, and laid blossoms at the grave that once held so much sorrow. And each time a breeze would pass, a sign the spirits were near. Old age came slowly to Olachi. She never married, she never left the village, but her face softened and her eyes stopped looking over her shoulder. She spent her days weaving baskets, teaching little girls how to wrap their heads, and telling stories about the old days, not as a victim, not as a villain, but as a witness. She did not seek pity, only peace. Her hair turned gray like moonlight on clay, her back curved like the gourd she drank from, and one evening, as the sun folded gently behind the hills of Odoku, Olachi lay on her mat, looked out at the tree line, and smiled. They say she whispered Kambili's name and then slept, and this time she did not wake. The village buried her beside the baobab, not beside Kambili, but near enough. Her grave was simple, no stone, just a calabash filled with white sand and yellow flowers. On her mat, the day she died, they found a note written in her own hand. I waited my whole life to be forgiven. I never imagined I would also be remembered. Years turned to decades. The tale of Olachi and Kambili became more than a story. It became a mirror. Across villages and towns, people told the tale to children who didn't know who the girls were, but knew what they stood for. It was no longer about urination on a grave. It was about envy that turns to poison, truth buried in silence, the courage to confess, and the grace to forgive. The baobab still stands, Kambili's flowers still bloom. And in the stillness of some nights, if the wind is just right, you'll hear the laughter of two girls, once torn by pride, now reunited in peace. Their story remains a whisper in the dust, a lesson in the soil, not just about what was done, but about what was learned.